Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, and then we're good to go. So Steve, hi and welcome, and thank you again for being here. It's really good of you to give your time. Steve and I have known each other for years, so it's good to reconnect. It was the first time we met each other or saw each other yesterday for some time, so it was really good to connect. I'm going to leave it to Steve to say hi and tell you a little bit about himself, and we'll take things from there. Is that okay, Steve?
That's fine, yes. Yes. Well, that's great. Well, welcome everybody. I see some familiar face. I see a familiar face there. Francis, hi.
Hello, Steve.
Yeah. Few people I remember, probably many I don't remember, but I apologise for that.
You don't look any different at all, I have to say.
Oh, bless you. Yeah.
Not at all.
You're looking good yourself.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, well, I'm going to talk for about, I don't know, 5 minutes or 10 minutes maybe. I'm going to raise more questions than answers. I suppose that's typically semi-retired for about the last maybe 2 years. And before that, full-time as an ontological coach, doing some organisational design work with local businesses. But more recently, I'm almost retired. I spend most of my time reading, exploring, and doing the odd bits of coaching with local people and local businesses. So it just comes along. I don't look for the work. It comes, and if I enjoy it, I do it. So I'm in that fortunate position. So I'm really sharing some insights and thoughts that have come to me over the years that may be interesting. Maybe new, maybe not. I suppose nothing's new under the sun, really, but it's just a different take, maybe, on some of the things we're all thinking about. Right, I think I'll start by just explaining a little bit about why life leadership. I'm certainly going to raise more questions, as I said, and the answers relate to what I perceive at the moment to be a VUCA world. Now, VUCA, I don't know if you're familiar with the term VUCA, but basically it was a way of thinking or looking at things that came out of the American Army training programs, where they were wanting to help their soldiers and their officers to think clearly when they get into battle situations, to think about the fact that in a volatile situation and that things are not always as they seem, and to think about what they think is known, what maybe they should know or can't see, and begin to sort of express it on that basis. Now, I seem to have lost the connection here.
You're still there, Steve.
Am I still here?
Yeah.
I can't see you.
Yeah, Pilar is sharing her screen, so I've asked her to take it off.
Oh, you can't see me, right? Okay.
You know, I don't know. Well, I can listen to you, Steve.
Oh, hello, Pilar.
Hi, Steve.
You're sharing your screen, Pilar. Can you stop sharing your screen?
All right, just a moment, please.
Because you blocked everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry.
We'll forgive you.
Oh my God, I don't know what to do. Oh my God.
Okay.
Now it's okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
So I suppose the issues that we're now facing are that we're beginning to see ourselves, therefore, in this world of ours as more vulnerable. We're living in systems dependent on other vulnerable living systems. So it's creating a stronger link, it seems to me, between our own nervous system, and it's becoming intertwined with nature's ecosystem. We're now realizing that in the words of the ecologist, we are a keystone species. That whatever we choose to do impacts on every other living system, from relationships to recycling of resources, renewable energy, animal welfare, etc. You can name them. So the problem that we face globally and locally is no longer someone else's problem, it's now ours to solve together. And we're all stakeholders in this enterprise. So what will it look like if we were to accept responsibility for the way that we lead our lives and hold ourselves accountable for each other's welfare? For this to happen, everyone everywhere will need to have a leadership role in regenerating the living systems that they rely on. And that's the focus really of what life leadership is about. Now these days, as I said, I'm semi-retired, so my coaching work focuses mainly on prying into the souls of leaders to try and gain some insights into how to shift their way of being and seeing things, to challenge their thinking about what leadership in a VUCA context might be. So for example, issues like gaining an awareness of systems thinking, improving the delivery and coordination of shared promises to get agreed standards into actions, to participate in making conversations, to get agreement about what's important and what works, and to create safe spaces to help get feedback on how to produce more agile, adaptable and regenerative ways of working. Now, I'm a child of the 60s, and in the words of Bob Dylan, times they are a-changing, and they certainly have been. But it's said that if you can remember the 60s, you probably weren't there, or were not fully engaged in protesting or partying. So it was certainly a time of great political and cultural instability, a lot of social responsibility clashing with the demand for individual freedoms, polarized thinking, swinging from pessimism to optimism, the assassination of JFK and the moon landings. But at that time, I was volunteering in the Solomon Islands in the Western Pacific. And so my reality in that period was probably very different. And I came back with certainly a new perspective on what life for me could be about. But as a post-war baby, I suppose I played my part in turning devastation from the war years into a prosperous future. Now here we are 60 years on, and we still live in volatile, uncertain and an ambiguous world. But it's compounded today by the scale, complexity and systemic nature of today's problems. I'm not going to go into the detail, you know what they are. So for example, our vulnerability today in day-to-day organizations and conversations comes out of uncertainty when we have difficulty trusting people who are unknown to us or maybe unreliable, that we fear they might let us down or blame us for their failures. It comes from volatility where we've come to rely on advice that can change without warning and it's unclear what we should really do in response. It comes from ambiguity when expert advice and verifiable data is subject to so many different interpretations and conclusions. And as a result, we struggle to get any agreement or confidence in our choices. And these experiences are not new, of course, but they are compounded by complexity when the interactions, the possibilities are so many and the outcomes impossible to predict with any accuracy. So we tend to resort to intuition and insight. So these VUCA challenges of today are really more existential. They're infecting our minds and our capacity to notice our blind spots and accept that we need to change our way of being to be effective in the world. So I'm posing two questions to get the discussion going. One is, how can we engage each other in conversations to gather data that we can agree on, to commit to producing safer, healthier, more caring and mutually supportive relationships? Obviously, this is particularly important as we come out of the lockdown. And what role can a positional leader and coach play in regenerating our capacity to think systemically, to speak authentically and act together in a mood of curiosity and ambition? The key here is very much about conversations and using conversations to get action, to gather data, to make better decisions, and to be able to see the connections in what we're all offering is our contributions. So that's a flavour of the tone that I wanted to start the discussion with.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. So some really important questions here. And just to kind of step back a little bit, I mean, part of why this is a big issue. I think Steve and I and lots of other people are using this term VUCA to capture the times we're living in. There's a sense that change is much more faster paced than it used to be, that, as Steve said, it's much more complex, things are much more interdependent. You can't do something here without it rippling and having a knock-on impact further downstream. It's much more complex, it's much more ambiguous. And we're seeing that, for example, with the COVID lockdown, what kinds of decisions need to be taken and what are the implications of some of those decisions. And one of the biggest issues, it seems to me, is in a time when we're moving so fast, information is complex and ambiguous. What do we trust for our sources of information? Where does that come from to allow us to make decisions? And I think that's the first question Steve is posing. What are the sources? How do we know? I mean, Steve and I were talking yesterday. Do we look more inward to our innate wisdom? Is that something we start to look at? And what does that mean? What does kind of turning inward to our innate wisdom means? And then the other question then was about, you know, what is it that we need to do to play a role to enable people to speak together? I mean, we're doing this on this platform, but what else can we do in our spaces, in our systems, in our places to support others to speak up and to collaborate together? So I hope those questions, Steve, did I capture those questions?
Yes, much better summarised than I.
So the floor is open. Any thoughts? I mean, any thoughts on VUCA? Any thoughts on what's been said so far?
Let Rebecca read.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone's quiet.
I think there's a Lorne and Steve and everyone. There's sort of your own environment, and then there's the wider environment in which you operate, whether it's work or as a citizen. And I think there's so much you may have control over and some that you won't. But as far as kind of trust and information, I think that sometimes you don't trust the information that you receive, either from politicians or because there are so many people with different views, and those views are spread around so many different mediums these days. It's so hard. I mean, you've got conspiracy theories, you've got what the politicians say when you watch media, the Prime Minister and other ministers, and you think, do we trust it? And you don't really know, because you can only hear and believe, you choose to believe it or not. And this thing about innate wisdom, I suppose with that people will have their own innate sort of instincts, and everyone will have that. And then there's the kind of the wisdom that comes from being slightly older than, say, someone who's 16, 20, 25. So you'll have more experience to draw upon. Having said that, this world as it is so changing and so ambiguous, it's, I suppose, you try and draw on all the things that made sense to you in the past. But I think that generally we're in a world where there's so much access to information that you're told not to trust people or links, or it's quite difficult. So I think years ago it was a lot simpler. I'm not saying those things weren't there, but it is easier to, you know, to worry about people taking your information or misleading people on saying things that you haven't said, because we're just so open. I mean, that's the first thought.
So go on, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is part of the issue of trying to access a variety of different perspectives. This is where teams often find that even the scope of their interest is limited, because there's so many stakeholders and partners who have a stake or a claim to be part of the discussion, because what they're deciding affects other people and other systems. So accessing that feedback to find out what makes sense to those different groups and bringing that together to get some kind of theme going around where the consensus might be, because you often find, as I'm sure you find, you start off with a great deal of lack of agreement because people see things differently and it affects them differently. And they're reticent to enter into any agreement because they don't feel they have agreement that they can be confident about. So there's a journey that needs to take place within teams and larger groups to begin to move towards greater certainty and greater agreement before choices can be made that they will all cooperate in. And that builds the trust. Without that, those relationships being built together, trust is very difficult to sustain.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other reflections then? So please jump in, and I mean, I've got some thoughts, but I don't want it to be just my voice today. Martin.
I'll jump in. I guess that the obvious context for this discussion is, society right now, and even pre-COVID society. And what Francis was touching on there is the part I think that's the kind of overwhelming as a challenge. You've got such a fundamental breakdown in civic discourse that we can't agree facts. It's literally, well, if I give you a fact from X source, the very fact that X source is not on my political side invalidates the fact completely, and therefore there can be no discussion. And I'm trying to figure out what sort of the VUCA mindset that the VUCA sort of analysis that you're bringing, what kind of insight it can lead to that. I mean, that's probably unfair. I mean, this is a huge international problem, but I'm just trying to figure out, or what analysis can it provide that gives us new insight that might sort of point to potential solutions. Sorry, I think that's a bit harsh of a question.
That's a good one.
It's a good one.
I suppose the way I tend to approach it is to try and sort of put a boundary around what we're going to talk about, what we're going to focus on, and see if we can ground any of the opinions that are presented. So, on what experience do you base that? It's not a case of what Trump said or what somebody else said or what have it. It's your understanding of what's being said. How does it relate to you, and is it meaningful to you? So to start with that, what are we talking about? To get clarity on the what, at least stops too many fluff and bits of messy bits entering the conversation. And then we can focus on, so if we agree about what we're talking about here, what kind of meaning are we giving to it? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for you? And it's that shared meaning that begins to get us to an understanding, if not total agreement, about what's real and what isn't real for us. I mean, truth is personal, isn't it? Let's face it. Unless it's universal, of course. But if we can come to some agreement about that to enable us to take action together, that's the key thing. Enough agreement for us to take action, then we know what to do in the next step. Now, once we've taken that step, things change. So we need to revisit the new situation that we've created in our minds and then question again. So what does this mean? And what action can we now take? So it's more an iterative process than let's develop a strategic plan. And we're going to do this next week and that next month and that next year. In some situations where I think Francis was saying, if you've got control over the process, then that's fine. If you haven't got control, then you need that consensus. And if you're relying on a leader to tell you what to do, then you're unlikely to get the buy-in that's necessary and the commitment to actually deliver. So a lot of things have to come into play in a context that Martin was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things I'm hearing from this then, it requires a very fundamental different way of being in relationship with others. Is going to take more time, for example, to do the kind of agreement, coming to agreement, shared meaning, and so on that you talk about, Steve, because we're used to product, we've talked in the past, Martin and others, about we're judged on the basis of how rapid we make decisions. Productivity is the kind of the watchword, the thing we're all about. So outputs, how many things can you do, and I think a couple of weeks ago, someone talked about we're so busy being human doers or doing human doings as opposed to human beings. And it's requiring us, it seems to me, to step back into, or at least to move forward in a fundamentally different way, that requires us to pause and be more reflective and to be much more aware, socially and otherwise, you know, personally and socially, about the context we're operating in, and what does it mean for me, what does it mean for the people who I'm relating to, and the system that I'm part of. And I think that's a big challenge. I mean, I don't know what other people think. Do you feel confident we could do that? Do we have the mindset at this moment in time to behave in that sort of way? Like to hear what others think?
Can I chip in a little bit here?
Yeah, of course.
One of the things is I think forgive me if I've got on the wrong track about it, but I think some of the things that we are making a problem of is because we're not communicating on a basic level. So when we look at, you know, going back to Martin's point about political, you know, positions and things like that, some of it is because there's no common denominator of the language we're using, and we need to either raise it up, which I think is going to be far difficult, than actually bringing it down to something that we can actually communicate with and converse with, you know, without people going, what's she talking about? Because we're not leveling that approach before we can go forward.
Yeah. That's a very good point indeed.
Can I just chip in as well about outputs and outcomes, because you were talking, Lorna, about that and about the productivity and the speed, etc. But I suppose if you look at the outcome, different people will have different ideas of what the outputs will be to reach that outcome. And then you've got the other issue, what if your outcome isn't like what people don't always have shared outcomes, they have different desires. So I suppose it's linking into people with similar general outcomes, and it depends what we're talking about. Is it personal lives, is it work lives, is it civic lives? So but I definitely believe that we are far too fast paced, we don't think enough, we don't have time or value. I mean, we might do, but I think generally people don't have time to think or think it's valuable enough. And it really is, because as you say about the human beings, are we being enough? We are humans, but we don't think about our being, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Jude and good. Yeah, sorry, go on. Jude.
Thank you. And just to add to that, I think when you talk about being fast paced, the fast pacing has been measured by are you meeting a grade? So it starts from, I mean, I remember when I was younger, I didn't have as many sort of hurdles to go through to say, were you performing at a level we're expecting you to perform in for your age? And those tests are actually tests of knowledge, not of being, not of self-awareness, not of connecting with a bigger society. We don't have that in our culture in the UK, where there's lots of other cultures that have a basis of connectivity that goes on, that says there's a social responsibility. You know, if you drop something, you pick it up, you put it in the bin, you help someone, you know, all of that. There's much more emphasis on that, whereas we're much more, you know, are you reading swiftly enough? Are you doing your numeracy and literacy quickly enough? And I think that's where we've been overtaken by this demand society that says this is how you perform, without this is how you are. Go back to Francis's point about younger people, you know, where's the connectivity there generationally with, you know, the bigger society? Yet we get a lot of flack thrown at the environmentalists, you know, for being so young and coming out of school to, you know, yet you know, that's quite an honourable thing to be doing. You know, in terms of, you know, going back to Steve's point about, you know, if you can't remember the 60s, you know, you're actually doing something there. So maybe that's true about the next generation. You know, they need to take themselves out of the boxes and say we are connected, and that's quite an honourable thing from my point of view, anyway.
So what does all of this mean then for how, I think was one of the questions Steve posed, or certainly in the paper he's written, what does this mean for the way we live and lead, certainly for the way we live our lives? Because if we're saying we're living in a world now where it's much more difficult to make decisions, because if information is now more contested than it used to be, perhaps, we're living in a time when things are much more complex, they're much more interrelated, and if we do something here, it does have an impact down there. You know, we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that we will ultimately impact everything and anything we do. And as I've said before, it seems to me that requires a fundamental shift in the way we go about living our lives. So what does that mean in practical terms for some of you? If you kind of accept that we've got something called VUCA and it's a term that means something, what does that suggest for in practical terms, how you live your lives, how you go about your day-to-day, how you make decisions, how you support your kids going forward? So I'd like to hear some thoughts from others, please. What are your thinking?
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
It seems to me when I face these situations in teams that the discussion is all over the place, because people actually talk about the same things, but it means something different to them. So there's an issue there about trying to get clarity, but that clarity tends to bring, which is Francis's point, you tend to bring in your experiences as varied as they are, which can be confusing the issue, but it can also inform the issue. So there needs to be a base built, I feel. What I try to do is to say, well, okay, so what is it in relation to this particular situation or context and the problem we're looking at? What do you care about? What do you need to care about to deal with this issue? What's important for us to care about? And it doesn't really matter whether it's children or leaders, executives, is to get some clarity as to, you know, why are you here? What's the purpose of our being here? What do we care about achieving together? And usually it gets down to the basics of how people want to treat each other, communicate with each other, respect each other's views and opinions, agree a mechanism for how we're going to build trust, how we're going to deliver on our promises, because the conversations we have are the key to delivering action. So unless we get the conversation properly, get organized, and we can trust the process of the conversation, we will not trust the results of it. So the outcomes, the results of that conversation. I think Francis's point was interesting, because she mentioned the fact that we might have different outcomes or want different outcomes. Well, that's the issue. The issue is that the actions we're taking as a team might not be delivering the results that we believe we should be getting. So the issue about improving our results is not so much about just changing the actions, but to change the way that we look at the results and what's meaningful from those results. Because it's when we connect with the meaning of the result and the value of it and why we think it's important, that we will get actions that will deliver a better result. And that seems to be the process that I find works. Not all the time, but at least it gets people get grounded to the issue that they're facing. If that makes sense.
So can we bring in Eddie and Martin and others and Judeline, and I think Rebecca, you're here as well. So hi, I've not seen you for a while. So great to hear. It'd be great to hear from you guys.
Sorry, I was having technical difficulties this morning.
Oh, hi, nice to see you.
Love the conversation. I agree that very good points. I think at a very young age, we are being taught to literally judge other people. You know, you're tested on how you read, you're tested on how fast you can run, you're tested on how high you can jump, like being trained to be little robots. But honestly, it because we're being trained that way in school and everything, I think that they take kindness out of the equation, and we have to learn to be kind even if we disagree, and we have to learn to come together even if we disagree. I just think our media is really bad because we don't know like what Francis is saying, we don't know what's real and what's not. It's really hard to decipher what's correct. And with that, judgments are being made from all of us, because that's what we do, that we don't know. We don't know, and we're just going to do what we do. But I think if you put that aside and just allow everyone to have their own ideas, but come together for the greater good, isn't it really just taking care of each other? And can we come to that agreement and put the rest behind us? So that's what I try to do.
What a great thought. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Really beautiful.
Really positive, Rebecca.
Yeah, really beautifully put. Thank you, Eddie. And I think we've got Eddie here, and also Neil and Pilar. It would be great to hear from you as well.
Can I just mention one thing?
Hi
there. Just touching on what Rebecca was saying. I was watching a news channel yesterday, and they're trying to do like an expose on China, where the whole of the COVID virus is cultivated and everything like that. But it's not. They don't just hold coronavirus. They actually hold about 300 plus different viruses within there, and they use it for epidemiology studies. And it's that sort of narrative that they were trying to arrange, that, because they've done this and they've launched it in the atmosphere, and that's why we have this problem. So there is that sort of narrative of a blame game taking place, which I think shouldn't actually really be happening. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of labs in the world where there's still smallpox and tuberculosis and all these old diseases that are still available. Even when it comes to the plague, there's still some samples available in different parts of the world. So, I mean, if they get unleashed, does that mean it's the country's fault, or is it the people's fault? So I think it's very important that we do need to differentiate and try and use common sense, which unfortunately is not that common anymore, if you think about it. And I try and be a bit more careful. Not so much careful, be just try and use your brain in that sense, that it's not everyone's individual fault, because things will happen. And yes, unfortunately, some of our leaders have been a bit strange about certain things without naming names. So I think it's time to be a little bit more community-based and, just trying to bring each other together. When we have plenty of other things that divide us, why should we create another thing anyway? It's one of the reasons I like going to music concerts, because it just brings everyone together from different backgrounds. So we need to have more things like that and discussions like these as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Moj. That's really great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. So Neil and Pilar, I know you're new to the group. I think most of the others have been coming for the last 4 weeks. So I don't know whether you've got anything you want to share or reflect on from the conversation thus far.
Sure, I can share. The conversation about outputs and outcomes, I'm thinking about just being here in New York City and the United States, and with the pandemic, and I just think of our leaders' actions reveals a lot, reveals the outcome. The outcome doesn't need to be explicitly said. And so for me here, just looking at the two outcomes that our country is dealing with is, the economy and saving lives. And the actions that leaders takes is revealing on which one's more important. So,
But I think does it not go to the heart of some of the challenges that perhaps Steve is alluding to, is the complexity of some of the issues and the difficulty of making decisions. So you've got, as you say, the economy, and you've got saving lives. Are they mutually exclusive? Are they polarities in this language that people talk about now? Dilemmas, polarities, whatever terminology that need to be managed? And if so, how do leaders trust themselves to make the right decisions? Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the difficulty for politicians, what it should be for politicians is the importance of creating the conditions that enable people to make good decisions. And those decisions will affect what it means to them. So to get political for a moment, we've got Boris Johnson telling us that this is generally what we need to be doing. Use your common sense, keep distance from people, make sure that you do this and try and do the other. And basically how we solve the problem in care homes and how we solve the problem in schools and how we solve the problem in transport is for the transport people to sort out, is for the schools people to sort out, because they know best what will work and what won't work for them. And the feedback then comes to the centre to modify what the policy or framework might be. And I think that's the issue. The issue for most big businesses today is not strategic planning. It tends to be trying to create a framework that will produce the conditions that will enable different parts of the business to make better decisions that fit the local circumstances. And they have to be trusted to do that. So if we know what the baseline is, as I was saying, we know what we're trying to achieve here and what the importance of these things are, and we can make decisions that don't negatively affect the welfare of others, then we should be able to enable them to play their part in bringing the whole thing together, rather than feel we can direct operations from the top or from the centre, because in a complex world that's not going to happen. And that's part of the reason why Boris is getting so much criticism from those who believe that, well, I need the boss to tell me what to do. Am I doing the right thing? What if I get it wrong? What will the parents think? What will the older people think if I make this decision or that decision? So we're all frightened to death of using our initiative and reading a situation and interpreting it for our own, what we feel is important. And that's what VUCA does to us. It shakes us into insecurity. And we're not used to the idea of living in a world where we can't predict what the outcome's going to be. So we need different ways of looking at how we operate that respects, embraces, deals with these uncertainties. And that means trusting people more. And how we go about doing that, that's the challenge.
That's the $1,000 question. Two things there for me, Steve, and again, just invite others to kind of chip in. And I'm going to be a little bit, I don't know if provocative is the right word, but one of the big issues potentially here with trusting others to do and make decisions, so trusting the schools and trusting the bus transportation people, is there a risk of fragmentation, that we lose sight of the greater good, for want of a better term? And I know you said this is about a framework and we should have some shared agreement and meaning about what is it we're trying to achieve. There's potentially here, it seems to me, one risk might be greater fragmentation. We've seen that to some extent in the shift towards this kind of identity politics, as different communities, different tribes, different groups want to assert their own authority. And I think it's a little bit like what Martin was saying before, that we've ended up in a much more fragmented way. So I wondered whether that's an issue. And then the second thing, which has completely slipped my mind, is really to do with this notion of human beings and are we the Rousseau kind of view of human beings? We're basically decent, and systems and external environments cause us to become horrible beings, or are we? Is it Hobbes? Who's saying we're naturally vile, self-serving, self-seeking individuals who kind of want to do our own thing? And I think some of this potentially it seems to me, starts to flag some questions about what's our view of human beings. And sorry to kind of get into philosophy now, but it just feels like it starts to flag some of those questions as well. Fragmentation on the one hand, and the nature of what trust means, and what's our understanding of human beings and our kind of essential nature, if there's such a thing. And please others, because I feel like I'm doing too much talking today because I'm meant to be facilitating. And Martin, I'm going to pull you in here because I know you've got views about this.
Pilar wants to speak.
Oh, sorry, Pilar, I didn't see you there. Okay. Pilar, please do jump in, and then I'm going to ask Martin, because I know we had a bit of a chat about it last week when we were starting to explore this question a little bit. So Pilar, over to you. Apologies, because I've got so many different things open. Pilar? You can unmute yourself.
Pilar, you need to put your speaker on. You unmute. Top of the screen.
Where is she? I can't see her.
If you hover your picture over the three
Unmute,
buttons on
okay,
your
I've unmuted
your
her, but she has to unmute
picture,
herself.
hover you'll see an unmute button or at the bottom of your page.
So I've unmuted you, Pilar, but you do have to unmute yourself. Okay, well, whilst Pilar is unmuting, Martin, can I bring you in?
Yep, sure. So that's a lot. I was struck by something that Steve had said about the delegation of problem solving and the comfort with uncertainty in the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's there's a lot of truth in that. I think in that maybe we're looking for some sort of prescription of do X and Y will happen, or some algorithm like do X and Y will come out.
Mm.
And that's not what's being said. The confusion as it relates to what I think is sometimes true in business, but is definitely true in politics right now, is the language. And it's interesting because I was reading the Steve's article, and he talks a lot about language and the significance of language in that. And what I noticed that the language coming from the political leadership, both of the United Kingdom and also the regions, is it is the language of central command. It is still, so they haven't adapted the language, yet they seem to be saying they want the delegated sort of decentralized outcome. They're saying, you must do this, right? Do this now, right? And you must stay away, and you can't see that, and you can't have, but you figure it out. Well, that's confusion. And but I think also that's true often in business as well, and interpersonally as well. It's kind of people, yeah, you go ahead and you run with the project, and then it's like, oh yeah, I don't like that. It's like it's that constant tension between the delegatory instinct, the process of delegation, making sure that somebody's able to have the freedom to come up with their solution, and then wanting to sort of define the process as well for them and say, oh no, I don't want you to do that. It's I'm trying to think of an example. I can't right now.
I'll give you an example, Martin.
Go.
Those who don't need to work at home, you need to go back to work now. However, the schools aren't back yet, so those with children who are too young to be left on their own, i.e. primary, well, they can't go back anyway, because I can understand, the sort of phasing of what we do, that's fine, but you can't then expect one part to be able to work if the other's not ready. Similarly, if you don't have your own transport, they tell you it's not really safe to go on public transport. But then if you haven't got any, you can't get to work anyway. So it's difficult. And there's a sort of a push me pull you. It's they're trying to sort of balance the economy and the health, but in the end it will all come into one, because if people are off work for too long, A, they could lose their jobs, B, their mental health goes, it's gone, it gets worse. Other illnesses can come because people are putting on weight, some people. Older people aren't able to get out and walk. They lose the motivation to get out. All sorts of other things will happen. Hello, I can see Pilar.
Yay!
And so just as a small example.
Yeah, just following on from Francis saying there, though, that it was just talking about the contradiction between those two instructions. And I think it stems from a contradictory leadership impulse. It's, we don't want to come up with a solution, but we want to, let me be slightly biased here. We want to take credit for the solution, for the positive solution. So we can say, and again, this happens in all spheres of leadership. But we can say, yay, it's up, you know, we're not trying to tell you what to do. You go, you go, you go. And if it's a success, yay, see what we did. I told you, you know, and I get the credit. And if it's all bad, it's like, well, you didn't do it right, you know. And I think, you know, if there's a contradiction in the motivation for the instruction, then that's only going to play out in how the actual operations of whatever is suggested is going to play out. I think that's inevitable.
Depends what kind of leader you've got, doesn't it? Depends on the leader's way of being, really, as to how supportive, how enabling, less blaming they are.
Yeah.
That's where the culture is built, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed.
That's, I think, what you're saying here, Martin, is.
Can I just add?
Yes, please, Hannah.
Oh yeah, can I just add to that? I mean, I watched the Prime Minister on Sunday, hoping to get quite a lot of information because I look after the HR in my company. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my screen's just gone all funny. And I'd set up a meeting on Monday afternoon with my team. There's 12 in our office, and on the back of Boris Johnson's announcement, we then had, well, I'm not really sure what I can tell you because all the detail is to come. So Boris Johnson made an announcement saying that you could go back to work tomorrow if you can. Use public transport. If you don't use public transport, but if you can't, use public transport, etc. But the detail in how to make your office COVID compliant will come later on in the week. So, you know, on the one hand, people complain about a nanny state and the government telling you how to do everything and you can't do this, you can't do that. But on the other hand, we do need good leadership where the guidance is given and the tools are given for you to then make these decisions. And I don't believe that happened at all or has happened. I mean, I spent the best part of today reading 50-page documents basically say, stay at home, wash your hands and don't go out.
Is that what it says?
It pretty much says that. There's a lot of washing your hands and be 2 meters apart and if you can't, then cover your face. But if you can't, then it's okay. So it is, you know, don't get me wrong, it must be one of the toughest things that any leader, government, anyone has had to face because we just don't know what the outcome is going to be and we just don't know what the long-term aspects are going to be. And the mental health issue is one that is completely unknown because you know, you are damned if you do, and damned if you don't, because, you know, so I know lots of people in my office that are completely scared at the thought of having to go back to the office. So, you know, there is a mental health issue of not being able to work, but also being forced to go back to work before you feel the environment is ready for you to go back, or the circumstances in which you can get back, i.e. you don't drive, you live in central, you know, you live in London and you work in central London. How else would you get back to work if you're not going to buy a bike and ride it and things like that? You know, there's a whole lot on the news at the moment and in general public just about how this is targeting the lower paid worker and the people that do have to work and have to go out to physically work, and the only way they can do so is using public transport, and they're completely exposed now because of what Boris Johnson said. You know.
Indeed, absolutely. So some big issues there. I'm just conscious of time. And Pilar, did you sort out?
I'll just say something very short. It's a very interesting debate and conversation. But after that, I'm sorry, I will have to leave. I just would like to mention something. To me, it was very important. Well, all your participation, but Judeline, I think she addressed an interesting thing that is related to language. And I think this is a very important word because make us think how we are communicating each other. What is the language that we are using? what really means this language. And as you know, at the moment we are living in interdependence situation in several ways that has to do with climate change, has to do with loss of biodiversity, migration, refugee, authoritarian regimes. I think all these issues we share nowadays worldwide. Then is, well, how we are communicating these things. As you know, we wake up with a lot of information and go back to bed with information. We are in some way bombing with information. It's too much information. But the big question is, what sort of this information is really worth? Are we having a sort of capacity to select of what sort of things we really wanted to be informed? And I say that because language has different branches. It has to do with clarity, with transparency, in the context that you talk. It has to do with disinformation, and obviously it has to do basically with ideology. Whatever you say, if you listen the sermon of a priest, the speech of a military, a cartoon magazine, whatever, there is underneath there is an ideology. Then at the moment, the leadership that we are having around the world in some way is very unpredictable. And it's very unpredictable because it's very much connected with the language that people with capacity calling, with power, can use the information to obtain certain goals that sometimes most of the population are unaware of this. Then that's why, I would say that language, language always was important since the humanity started, because human being has the enormous capacity for disinformation. If you go back to the prehistory, men, when they wanted to feed, they have to simulate animal sounds. They had to use several techniques in order to have the capacity to on the species. Then this information is as old as civilization. But some people, not in a pretentious way, it has to do with education. It's a sort of binomial, interesting and communication can realize these things.
That's brilliant.
Brilliant. I mean, Pilar, you're getting lots of people agreeing with everything you're saying, so that's fantastic. And Steve, I don't know whether you want to just kind of share your reflections on what Pilar, Hannatu, Martin and Judeline have been saying, and Francis have been saying.
Yeah, so just one comment really, I think that was striking me, what Pilar was saying, that the issue is about language is that we tend to pay attention to the things that we care about. So inevitably, if your agenda or ideology is to maintain power over others, then the choice of language and what you pay attention to reflects where you're coming from. And I think this is one of the key things. I don't know how much you know about ontological coaching, but ontological coaching starts from the point of that whatever you choose in your language, whatever mood you adopt, whatever body postures you have, are very reflective of your way of being. So how you see the world, how you think you should be in the world, influences the relationships you have with the world and therefore the impact you can have on the actions of others. So that's where I think Pilar's contribution was very interesting, because wrestling with that issue is that if we want to improve leadership, because what we're saying is we are good leaders, it's everyone else who's not very good at leading. But if we reflect on ourselves, we'll begin to see that we also have the blind spots, the biases, the particular perspectives on things that mean that we want to be able to lead the way we want to lead. And that isn't going to work in the VUCA world. The way we lead has got to be developed with others. It's got to be co-produced. Leadership's got to be distributed. It isn't going to be in the hands of one person. That's the only way we're going to shake the dominant culture that we've got at the moment, that says that leadership comes from the top. It needs to tell us what to do. And if they don't get it right, then we shoot them or we vote them out. We've got to find a way of organizing ourselves in communities, having conversations in communities and teams that build a better kind of leadership, a better kind of way of making decisions, and then we can go forward.
So I'm conscious we've gone through our hour, but I wanted to give everyone a sort of last comments, please, last takeaways or any reflections.
Yeah, please.
If we can keep it brief, that would be great. So,
I'd appreciate some feedback. Am I talking a lot of nonsense here?
I think it was, I can't remember, it was quite a long article, but I do remember thinking that, reading and thinking about what you said about how it's got to be a shared response. It can't just be one way, it's got to be two ways from now on, because actually sometimes we've got the solutions, etc. And I think that's what you've kind of just summed up. And I think in the VUCA world, I think that's how things probably need to change, not just in personal, but in civic and in sort of the superstructure, the government, etc. I think we would hope that it will, because we've kind of gone back to communities a little bit, because people have looked into their own families, they've looked a little bit wider into their communities, and they're noticing what's going on in their communities. Because I mean, I'm talking too much, I don't want to, but I think it kind of picks up your kind of one of the conclusions you made, that it has to be shared. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Francis.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah.
Thank you. Others, please, reflections and feedback for Steve. Did what he say make sense? Anything that really caught your attention?
Just want to ask a question of Steve then. Where does it start then? Because if that's why we're going for, where does it start?
It must start.
How long have you got? Sorry.
I think it starts by, which is what I find with the work I do with leaders, it has to start with yourself, in the sense that unless you're an observer of the language you use, the mood you're in, the body language you display, your sense of presence or lack of it, once that awareness grows, then you realize that you can actually have a better relationship and a better impact on getting things done that everybody wants done, things that we care about, if you're better at making those connections. And if leaders actually work on helping others to see their blind spots and their biases and sharing them, then we'll feel less vulnerable about getting things wrong, making mistakes, because the people around us are there to help us to be more effective, rather than sitting in judgment about the fact you weren't effective, you weren't good enough. So we've got to create that culture, and we can do it in our relationships with our families, in our teams, and we can grow from there.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Judeline, for that great question. Any final, anyone who feels the need to jump in and share final reflections before we thank Steve for his time and his great contribution. It's been really lovely. Yes, big round of applause.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
You're too kind. You're too kind.
It's been really great.
I can't clap. I'm holding my phone.
I only clap on Thursdays.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And as always, thank you everyone for coming. And it's been a really fascinating conversation, and certainly something I think, as Steve said, it's for all of us to take responsibility. You didn't use that word, but it seems to me that's the message. All of us to take responsibility for noticing how we are showing up. What are we passionate about? What motivates us? What are our interests? What are our moods? What are our emotions? And so on. So it starts with us as individuals, and then how we kind of percolate from there to impact and influence others. So in that sense, and I think that's one of the messages I got from Steve's report, we're all leaders in that sense. Is that right, Steve? Have I understood that clearly enough, that in that sense we can all be leaders and we're all leaders? So huge, great thanks. And if you haven't got the report and haven't been able to download it, drop me an email or get in touch with me on LinkedIn, or Steve is on LinkedIn as well, and we'll make sure you get a copy. But thank you again, everybody, and hopefully see you again very soon. Have a great week, and continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorna. Bye.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thanks, Steve.